When the rescue ship arrived, some of the survivors refused to board. They had watched 180 people die around them, children, spouses, friends, and still they believed. They believed. They believed in Poyais. They believed in the man who had sent them there. And when the 50 who made it home finally reached Britain, they did something no one expected. They signed a document officially absolving Gregor MacGregor of all blame. The man who printed fake currency and sold them land in a country that did not exist. The man who published a guidebook describing an opera house, a cathedral, and a thriving capital city, when the reality was 4 collapsing huts in a malarial swamp. The man whose fraud killed their families. They defended him. They blamed ship captains and local administrators. They could not accept that they had been fooled even as they buried their dead. MacGregor never spent a day in prison for any of it. He continued selling Poyais certificates for 14 more years, and when he died in 1845, he was buried with full military honours in Caracas Cathedral, with the President of Venezuela leading the funeral procession. 180 victims in unmarked jungle graves, one conman in a hero's tomb. This is the story of the fraud so complete it turned its victims into believers, and its killer into a legend. Gregor MacGregor was not pretending to be a soldier. He was one, and that made everything worse. MacGregor's credentials were real. That was the trap. By 1817, at 30 years old, he had risen to General of Division in the Venezuelan army, credentials he would later weaponize into a death warrant signed in ink. He fought alongside Simón Bolívar in the War for South American Independence. He led a month-long fighting retreat through hostile territory that military historians still study. He received the Order of Liberators from Bolívar himself, and he married Bolívar's cousin, Dona Josefa Antonia Andrea Aristeguieta y Oliveira, within 2 months of arriving in Caracas. Every conman needs a foundation. MacGregor's was built on blood he actually spilled for a cause he actually believed in. His victims never stood a chance. This was not his first invented country. On June 29, 1817, MacGregor captured Amelia Island off the coast of Spanish Florida with 150 men. He declared the Republic of the Floridas. He raised the Green Cross of Florida over Fort San Carlos. He printed currency, Amelia dollars, to pay his troops. And then, 68 days later, when American support failed to materialize, he fled to Nassau and abandoned the entire project. He had already learned that you could print money for a country that existed only in your head. Poyais was simply the perfected version. In April 1820, MacGregor landed at Cape Gracias a Dios, the eastern shore of what is now Honduras, where the jungle meets the Caribbean, one of the most remote coastlines in the Western Hemisphere. There he met King George Frederic Augustus of the Mosquitia, an indigenous leader whose territory the British recognised. Watch what happens next. The king signed a document granting MacGregor 8 million acres of jungle territory, an area larger than Wales, in exchange for rum and jewellery. The grant itself was real, or real enough. King George Frederic Augustus did sign something. MacGregor was not lying about that. He was lying about everything he built on top of it. MacGregor sailed home with that document, and then he began to build, not buildings, something larger, a country. The centrepiece of the fraud was a book, nearly 400 pages, published in Edinburgh in 1822 under the name Captain Thomas Strangeways. That name was invented. The book was called Sketch of the Mosquito Shore, including the territory of Poyais. Every word in it was fiction dressed as fact. The capital, St. Joseph, had 20,000 inhabitants according to the guidebook. Wide paved boulevards, colonnaded government buildings, a theatre, an opera house, a domed cathedral. The Bank of Poyais, ready to exchange your British pounds for local currency. 12 provinces with 3 legislative assemblies and a functioning court system. The soil was so rich, the book promised, that farmers could harvest Indian corn 3 times per year. Game so plentiful that a single day of hunting could feed a family for a week. Gold mines awaiting discovery. The book was a bestseller, and MacGregor was just getting started. He hired street singers to perform ballads about Poyais on corners in London, Edinburgh and Glasgow. He opened official Poyaisian Legation offices, first at Dowgate Hill in London, later at 23 Threadneedle Street, steps from the Bank of England. He created a constitution with a tricameral parliament, a coat of arms featuring 2 unicorns, and a national flag with a green cross on white. He printed currency, Poyaisian dollars, exchangeable at the legation for your British pounds. The currency may have been printed by legitimate presses. One account suggests the Bank of Scotland itself. Settlers were encouraged to convert their life savings before departure. Real money for fake money, handed over willingly, and then came the bonds. The London Stock Exchange, the same exchange that traded Mexican and Colombian bonds, listed Poyais right alongside them. The smartest money in Britain was about to buy government debt from a government that had never met. On October the 22nd, 1822, the Poyais government bond issue launched. 2,000 bonds at £100 each, 6% annual interest. Total value, £200,000. The bonds were backed by all government revenues of the Republic of Poyais, revenues that did not exist, from a government that had never met, for a country that was 4 abandoned shacks in a malarial swamp. The bankers who subscribed the loan were not nobodies. John Perring was a baronet, a Member of Parliament, and a former Lord Mayor of London. Nathan Shaw sat on the Lloyds Committee. These men lent their names and their reputations to bonds for a country they had never visited, backed by nothing but MacGregor's word. The smartest money in London saw through it. Nathan Mayer Rothschild received a letter from MacGregor in June 1821 proposing investment, even suggesting a Jewish colony in Poyais. Rothschild said no. The Rothschilds always said no. Everyone else said yes. Land certificates went on sale at 2 shillings 3d per acre, a working man's daily wage. Demand was so high that MacGregor raised the price to 4 shillings. By early 1823, more than 500 people had purchased Poyaisian land. They paid more than £17 million in today's value for deeds to jungle that MacGregor had no authority to sell. The money was in. Now MacGregor needed settlers to make the lie look true. Picture the dock at London in September. Families with trunks, children asking when they would see the Opera House. A cobbler who sold his shop to become official shoemaker to the princess. They waved goodbye to England. Most would never see it again. On September 10, 1822, the Honduras packet sailed from the port of London carrying 70 emigrants to Poyais. These were not desperate people fleeing poverty. These were Britain's professional class, doctors, lawyers, a banker, soldiers whose families had purchased commissions in the Poyaisian army and navy, an Edinburgh cobbler who had accepted the post of official shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais. They brought tools and supplies for a new life. They exchanged their savings for Poyaisian dollars. Some carried letters of appointment to government posts in the thriving capital of St. Joseph. A second ship, the Kennersley Castle, left Leith in October 1822 with nearly 200 more settlers. Families, children, craftsmen who had sold everything for passage to paradise. Leading them was a man named Hector Hall, a former British Army officer whom MacGregor had commissioned as Lieutenant Colonel of the Poyaisian 2nd Native Regiment of Foot and ennobled as Baron Tinto. Baron of what? Native Regiment of where? The title was as real as everything else MacGregor created. Approximately 250 people sailed toward Poyais between September 1822 and early 1823. They arrived to find nothing. Not a city of 20,000, not an opera house, not a bank, not a cathedral, not a government building, not a single paved boulevard. What they found were 4 rundown shacks amid the ruins of a British settlement abandoned the previous century. A swampy forest, biting insects, venomous snakes, no supplies, no officials, no Princess of Poyais for the shoemaker to serve. A British newspaper, The Guardian, would later report, nothing could exceed their anguish at finding where they expected a fine flourishing town with nearly 2,000 inhabitants, only 2 or 3 ruined huts. The Poyaisian dollars they carried were worthless. No one would accept the currency. No government would honour the deeds. No government existed to honour anything. The government posts were worthless. There was no government. And then they started deeing. Imagine standing where they stood. The air is 90 degrees and saturated. Mosquitoes cloud every surface of exposed skin. The water you drink comes from the same river where you bury your dead. There is no quinine, there is no doctor, or rather the doctors who came are dying alongside everyone else. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. You watch your children's skin turn yellow. You watch them shake with fever. You dig their graves in mud that floods back overnight. The jungle ate them. Thomas Burgess, boat builder from Slateford, dead. Malcolm McDougall and his wife from Canongate, dead. Peter Smith, blacksmith from Dundee, and his wife, dead. William Horne, baker. dead. The man who had been designated official royal shoemaker, who had left a family behind in Edinburgh to serve a princess who did not exist, shot himself. Another settler, trying to escape, built a canoe to find help. He drowned. Of the 250 settlers who sailed to Poyais, more than 180 died. James Hastie was a Scottish sawyer who emigrated with his wife and 3 children on the Kennersley Castle. 2 of his children died of tropical disease in that jungle. Hastie survived. He made it back to Britain, and then he published a book defending Gregor MacGregor. He wrote that the disaster seemed to be the will of Providence, not the will of the man who had printed a guidebook describing an opera house that did not exist. The rescue came by accident. In early May 1823, the schooner Mexican Eagle was returning from the court of the Mosquito King. On board was Marshal Bennett, Chief Magistrate of British Honduras. Bennett was not looking for settlers. He was conducting routine colonial business. When the Mexican Eagle found them, fewer than 70 people remained alive from the 250 who had sailed. Bennett told them the truth. There was no such place as Poyais. He ferried the survivors to Belize in 3 trips. The colonial authorities spent £4,290 rescuing, nursing, feeding and clothing them. A significant expense charged to British taxpayers to clean up a conman's disaster. Some survivors were too weak to travel on the first rescue trips. They stayed behind, dying in the jungle while waiting for the ship to return. And according to at least one account, some survivors refused to leave at all, even standing in the swamp surrounded by graves, watching their families rot. They could not accept that Poyais was a lie. They remained convinced it was all a misunderstanding. The psychological grip of the fraud was total. When the survivors reached Britain in October 1823, they did not demand justice. They did not call for MacGregor's arrest. They signed a declaration stating that Sir Gregor MacGregor had been worse used by Hector Hall, the fake baron who had led them into the jungle, and his other agents than was ever man before. The man who killed their families? A victim. The fake baron who led them into the jungle? The real villain. The administrators and ship captains who had nothing to do with the fraud? Blamed. This is what a perfect con looks like, not one that takes money, one that takes reality. To admit MacGregor was a fraud meant admitting they'd killed their own children by bringing them here. Blaming ship captains was easier than blaming themselves. One so complete that even after the victims watched their children die, they cannot admit they were fooled. MacGregor left London shortly before the survivors arrived home. He had already fled to Paris. There he did exactly what you would expect from a man who had just killed 180 people with a lie. He started the same scheme again. French investors proved as eager as British ones. MacGregor raised almost £300,000 selling Poyais bonds and land certificates to a new set of believers before French authorities seized his ship and arrested him on December 7, 1825. The trial began in Paris in July 1826. MacGregor stood accused alongside 3 accomplices, 2 Britons who had helped run the London operation, and a French banker named Louis Lehuby. His lawyer, Merilho, used a delay in the proceedings to help MacGregor prepare a 5,000-word defence statement, a detailed, mostly fictional account claiming he had acted in good faith based on a legitimate land grant. The grant existed. The king had signed it. That was technically true. Everything else MacGregor built on that foundation was fiction. But the French court acquitted him, citing lack of concrete proof of criminal intent. Only Lehuby was convicted, sentenced to 13 months. The mastermind walked free. MacGregor returned to London in 1827 and opened a new office at 23 Threadneedle Street, near the Bank of England. He issued a new bond of £800,000. When an anonymous handbill circulated warning against the Poyais humbug, he scaled back, but he did not stop. Someone had to print handbills warning Londoners not to buy bonds for a country that had already killed 180 people. Even then, MacGregor kept selling. In 1830, he was still selling land certificates. Physical specimens dated December 31st, 1830, survive in museum collections today. In 1836, he reprinted the Poyaisian Constitution from Edinburgh. In 1837, 16 years after the first settlers sailed, MacGregor made his final recorded attempt to sell Poyaisian land. 16 years, 180 dead, not a single day in prison, and still selling. He was never prosecuted in Britain, not once. The establishment that had bought his bonds, that had lent him their names and their newspapers, that had waved settlers off to their deaths, they never charged him with anything. In 1838, MacGregor's wife Josefa died. He had nowhere left to go in Europe, so he returned to the place where his story began. Venezuela welcomed him as a hero. The government granted him citizenship. They confirmed his rank as a divisional general in the Venezuelan army. They awarded him a military pension of 1/3 his salary for his service in the independence wars. The obituaries in Caracas praised his heroic and triumphant retreat to Barcelona in 1816. They said nothing of the swamp, nothing of the graves, nothing of 250 settlers or 180 bodies in the jungle. When Gregor MacGregor died on December 4, 1845, at 58 years old, President Carlos Sublet led the funeral procession. Cabinet ministers followed. Military chiefs marched behind the coffin. He was buried with full military honours in Caracas Cathedral. 180 people died because he printed a guidebook describing an opera house that did not exist. 180 names, most of them lost. The few we know, Thomas Burgess, Malcolm McDougall, Peter Smith, William Horne, mark the scale of what was erased. Bodies in unmarked jungle graves, children who never made it home. And the man who sent them there rests in a cathedral under a government headstone in the country he helped liberate, while the country he invented exists only in yellowing bond certificates and 400-page books of fiction. The jungle where they died has swallowed every trace of them. No memorial, no marker, no names on any stone. The shacks they found were ruins by the time they arrived, ruins of a previous British failure, and those ruins have long since rotted into the earth. If you travelled to the Black River today, you would find nothing. Trees, water, insects. The country that never existed has left no scar on the country that does. MacGregor spent his final years in Caracas petitioning the Venezuelan government for a higher pension, for greater recognition, for the honours he felt he deserved. He got them. But the name Poyais followed him. When British newspapers reached Caracas, he knew what they said about him. The country that remembered him as a liberator was not the country he came from. He died 3,000 miles from Scotland in a language not his own, surrounded by monuments to a war he had actually won, while the war he invented cost him everything he had in Britain. He got the hero's burial, just not in the place that mattered. The fraud was so complete that it outlived the victims, outlived the conman, and still sits in archives today. Land certificates for a country that never was, currency for an economy that never traded, bonds for a government that never met. Poyais is the textbook. The survivors who blamed the ship captains are the exam, and Caracas Cathedral is the grade the world gave the professor. A mass murderer sleeps there in honour, while somewhere in the Central American jungle the people who trusted him have no graves at all.